Conflict relations involve the mutual engagement of both types' superego blocks. The very essence of one type is the foil of the other. What one type most values and does most naturally, the other type devalues, precisely because they struggle immensely with it. To put it in socionics terms, each type's ego block is the other's superego block. And as the conflict relation suggests by its name, this is a recipe for some trouble. Obviously, to understand conflict relations, it is then necessary to understand the nature of the ego and superego blocks and the four individual functions that make those blocks up. And to understand those four individual functions, it is necessary to understand a little more about socionics, which I, unfortunately, have missed in previous socionics videos. In the original model of socionics, as I understand it, and the name of that model is Model A, you'll hear that a lot with socionics. It is A because that was the first letter of the name of the founder, whose name I can't pronounce. In Model A, every function slot in the 8-function stack falls on one side or the other of 7 dichotomies, giving each slot a unique character in relation to its neighbors. The dichotomies can be roughly summarized as follows. 1. Is it other people's business or not? That's my little summary for it. That is to say, is it a public function? That's the official name for it. Does it feel a certain accountability towards the outside world as though it needs to fulfill obligations in society? Or is it a private function, feeling no such accountability and perfectly happy to be itself, for itself, within oneself? The ego and superego functions are all public, while the superid and id functions are all private, meaning that conflict relations only deal with the public functions. All four of those individual functions involved in conflict relations are all public. They feel this obligation in society. They feel like it is other people's business. 2. Do you find it easy or difficult to use? That is to say, is it a strong function, meaning there is little to no difficulty when using it, or a weak function, meaning there is significant resistance or difficulty? The ego and id functions, or those blocks, are strong, while the superego and superid functions are weak, meaning that in conflict relations, part of the reason there's conflict is you have the ego which is the ego functions which are strong, facing off against superego functions which are weak. 3. Do you enjoy using it? That is to say, regardless of how adept you are at it, strong versus weak, do you actually get enjoyment from the function? If so, it is valued, the ego and superid blocks. But if not, if it feels like drudgery, then it is subdued, the superego and id. And it is important to note, once again, the ego and the superego face off, because the ego functions enjoy themselves, the superego functions do not. And it's interesting to note, just so you know, that the superid functions, which would be your tertiary and inferior functions, they are weak. You're not very good at them relatively, but you still really enjoy using them. So it's just an interesting notion within socionics. 4. In its block, does it command or obey? That is to say, is it demanding, having another function do its dirty work, quotation marks, and fulfill its determined goals, or is it the function which actually listens and obeys and does that, quote, dirty work? Is it the supplying function? Within each block, the function with the same rationality as the leading function, J or P, judging or perceiving, is always the demanding function, which relies on the supplying function to help it out. So in the ego block, for me in INFJ, it would be NI, which is my dominant rationality. It is therefore the demanding function of FE. In the superego block, for me, that is SI and TE. SI is perceiving. It's the same rationality as my dominant function, therefore it is the demanding function in that sort of relationship. 5. Will it compromise or not? That is to say, is it flexible, willing to adapt its operations to external demands and circumstances, or is it stubborn, that is, not willing to do so? Flexible functions are always on the right in the socionics model, and stubborn functions are always on the left. 6. Does it sometimes turn off, or is it always on? That is to say, is it variable, shutting off when not in use, or is it consistent, meaning it never turns off but is always around, active and responsive to feedback, for better or worse? Variable functions are on the right for the ego and superego blocks, but on the left in the private blocks, the super-id and id blocks. Finally, 7. Is it boisterously apparent or mild-mannered? That is to say, is it bold, unabashed, open, and confident in itself, or cautious, that is, none of those things, but rather self-conscious and shy? The functions that share the rationality of the leading function are always the bold functions. With these dichotomies explained, let's see what this means for the functions relevant in a conflict relation, namely the ego and superego functions. For one, all the functions most involved in conflict relations, like I said before, are public functions. They feel an accountability to society and imposed responsibility on them. The ego functions, however, are also strong and valued, like I mentioned, meaning that one is both good at using them and enjoys doing so. Thus, obligations placed on ego functions by society are no trouble because they are easily fulfilled. But the superego functions are weak and subdued. One isn't good at them and doesn't like them, yet feels, because they're public, that they have to do better at them because it's important for surviving in the world. This disparity between disliking the function yet feeling an obligation regarding the function creates a severe tension within the superego block. To engage the superego block, then, is to remind one's personality of its most embarrassing weaknesses, of which one has gradually grown rather resentful usually because they feel that the outside world requires something of them which they cannot really fulfill. It's very frustrating and threatening to be reminded of this. Nothing spoils the enjoyment of one's ego block quite like a reminder of one's superego block. Thus, one can already see the problem inherent in conflict relations, which involve one person's most confident functions engaging directly another person's least confident functions. Within the blocks themselves, there are also differences between the functions. The first function is called the leading function, and sometimes the base or program function, depending on specific translations of the original languages. In addition to its ego traits, it is also consistent in its output. One can rely on it to react similarly in every scenario, more or less. It is similarly stubborn and bold, that is, uncompromising and boisterous in its ways. Finally, it is demanding of the second function, using it to accomplish its goals. This second function is called the creative function, because it serves to create things on behalf of the leading function, not unlike a tool. As an ego function, it is also strong, valued, and public. However, all the other dichotomies for it are switched from the leading function. Here it is the supplier, and it is also variable and flexible and cautious, making it rather adept at the role of being a supplier. In many ways, it is like a competent, obedient servant that drops everything and comes when it's called to do the work. For instance, in the INTJ, extroverted thinking serves the purposes of their introverted intuition. NI provides a vision, and TE is consulted for carrying it out, working with the external world, interfacing with that world of facts in order to do this. But the INTJ would not be said to exude TE in the way that they exude NI. If you want someone who exudes TE, then you talk to an ENTJ, where TE is the leading function. TE comes in for the INTJ when it's needed. It does its job well, but it's not boisterous, nor is it demanding, nor is it stubborn in its ways. It works with things. The third function here is called the role function. As a superego function, it is weak, subdued, but still public, meaning that although one does not enjoy it and is not good at it, yet they still feel that it's a matter of public concern, making it a point of severe inadequacy and embarrassment. The vulnerable function shares these traits as well, and we'll get to the vulnerable function in a moment. What sets the role function apart from the vulnerable function is that 1, the role function is the commander of the vulnerable function. 2, yet often it just turns off when not engaged. 3, it's flexible regarding what is required of it. And 4, it's boisterous in what it actually does. So let's sum that up for a moment. If the leading function is a talented, upright, disciplined, and respected, if a bit full of themselves, or sometimes very full of themselves, commander-in-chief, then the role function is their untalented, undisciplined, perpetually hungover younger brother who got their job because of family connections, nothing more. They aren't a bad person. Most of the time they're pretty chill, and people don't mind them that much, but they aren't a good leader, because they spend most of the time asleep and negligent to their duties. But every once in a while, society will demand that they get their life together, and the role function energetically and half-drunkenly leaps to their feet and agrees, making a whole lot of promising plans to get off the alcohol and exercise more, and then just fails to follow through with all of it and just goes back to normal. Hence the name role function. It feels it has a public role given by society, but it is continually inadequate to the task. Meanwhile, you've got the vulnerable function. That's the fourth function. This is the role function's poor subordinate. The vulnerable function is 1, always on. It never falls asleep. 2, it's obstinate in its ways. Yet, 3, it's both cautious and mild-mannered. If the creative function is a disciplined and trustworthy assistant, kind of like Spock to Captain Kirk, then the vulnerable function is an insecure, resentful, passive-aggressive who feels overworked by their good-for-nothing commander, but won't do anything actually productive about it because they're still kind of scared. For any of you who ever played Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, like, this is the only image I can come up with in my mind that's perfect. Ingo to Talon on Lon Lon Ranch. Ingo is kind of like how I'm envisioning the vulnerable function here. When the role function is assigned a task, they either just don't do it, being asleep, or they recognize that it is their legitimate responsibility, they feel sheepish and guilty about that, they set about trying to do their job while having a severe hangover. But when the vulnerable function is assigned a task, usually by the role function, the insecurity and resentment is at the forefront there. They know they should do their job. In fact, they attach personal worth to doing their job. But they hate everything their job stands for and hate the conditions they are expected to work in. This makes them feel more insecure, more frustrated, and thus more resentful. If you want to mess someone up, or even get them frustrated and extremely defensive, then target their vulnerable function. Incidentally, the vulnerable function is also called the point of least resistance, or the POLR. With all of that understood, we can see the intricacies of how these functions would interact in the conflict relationship. The leading and vulnerable functions of each party connect, and the creative and role functions also connect. That's because they're the same functions in both parties. So here's a matrix of their contrasting traits, just so that it's all summarized on the screen. In a conflict relationship, in an actual relationship, each person's vulnerable function, for instance my TE, confronts itself, but itself in the role of the leading function in another person. So the insecure, vulnerable subordinate, using that image, Ingo or whatever, suddenly sees itself as someone incredibly good at its job, enjoying its job, calling the shots, not afraid to stand out, fulfilling society's expectations, etc. Thus, the funny thing about conflict relations is that Remarkably often, I don't think it happens all the time, it really just kind of depends, but there are a number of times when the two types will actually be rather attracted or at least very intrigued by each other upon first meeting, or when there's a psychological distance with each other, because they sense the actualization of what they themselves rather unconsciously wish they could be. It is natural to try out, I think, a sort of mutual student-master relationship here, the emphasis being on the trying it. The point being that many people don't see what the big deal is with conflict relations, because the title conflict implies that there's like explosions and hatred and they're like arch nemeses. But that's not necessarily, if I don't even think it's often the case here. As the distance closes between two people, as the pair ventures into becoming more emotionally intimate, and especially if the two types need to work on something together or communicate more frequently with each other and coordinate, that's when problems will gradually come to the forefront. See, the problem is that, or at least the biggest problem, is that the vulnerable function isn't actually secure enough to receive and use critique, at least not for very long. Confronted by a healthy exercise of itself in the leading function, this makes the vulnerable function feel horridly inadequate over time, and as a result, rather resentful and frustrated with the other person, who can do these things so easily. This leads one to present their leading function instead, to show how their team of functions has competent staff as well, which should more than make up for the weaknesses of the vulnerable in the role. But to the personality's eternal frustration, the other person will never agree with them because they are making the exact same move. They are continually putting their best face forward. The horrible irony being that their best face is what makes the other person's functions feel more inadequate, so they put their best face forward, which makes the other person feel more inadequate, so they put even stronger their best face forward, and you kind of have this cycle. So it builds, each type to assert their preferences against the other, both feeling as though the other person thinks they're worthless or evil or stupid, and trying to argue against this image by being even more of the thing that makes the other person think that they're worthless, evil, or stupid. Each type's fundamental mode of being is unappreciated by the other, making communication and validation rather difficult on any intimate level. Just by being themselves, they make the other person frustrated, confused, and inadequate. Kind of in the same vein, these problems in conflict relations, at least according to the reports I've read and the predictions I've read, they aren't usually explicit, if ever explicit. Outsiders may not even notice that there's anything really going wrong because it's this engagement of these more unconscious, unseen functions. Those involved in the relation, in fact, may not even know for sure whether anything is wrong, because the irritation is on such a fundamental level that it can often feel more like a slow burn or a buildup of pressure over time, or it's just like, I just don't like this person, but I have no real good reason why, because they seem like a respect-worthy person for me. Something is misread here, something really rude is done there, something is grossly unappreciated there, etc. But often these little things are endured rather longer than one might expect. The inadequate worker is meeting its perfected version and is reminded of all of its failings. Thus, this can carry a somewhat misplaced moral obligation to take courage and face the other person without too much complaint. In fact, people in these relations can develop, I think, an unhealthy sense that they have to somehow succeed in this relation in order to succeed with themselves, hence the tendency to this kind of dark one-upmanship cycle. They have to get this other person to like them because they're trying to get their superego block to like them and to work. So, to review, the main points of interest between the leading function and the vulnerable function in these two people are: 1. The leading is good at its job, but vulnerable is not. 2. Leading likes its job, but vulnerable does not. 3. leading commands while vulnerable responds, and 4. Leading is bold and boisterous while vulnerable is cautious and quiet and self-conscious. But with the creative function versus the role function, the points are a bit different. The first two are the same. Creative is good at its job and it enjoys its job, while the role is neither of those things. But the other two traits are swapped. The creative function obeys while the role function commands, and creative function is conscious while the role function is bold. The image here, then, is between the subdued, intelligent, and unassuming Spock, waiting on his captain for orders, but now meeting a drunken, lazy version of itself, trying in unsuccessful though energetic bursts to fulfill the role of captain. So unlike the leading function, which is always on and always bold and a little full of itself, the creative function always hangs back. It's more modest in its abilities, and therefore it's not as likely to engage the role function, much less disturb it. On the contrary, there is almost a paradigmatic reversal of the situation that you had with the leading and the vulnerable, where the role function is trying unsuccessfully to dominate the other's creative function. Or that's kind of at least what it would normally do. For the role function is bold and more outspoken. And when it does wake up, it views its role as one of leadership. Thus, even though it is both weak and subdued, it is more likely to occasionally critique the other person's creative function as though from a position of knowledge, saying in effect, you know, you're really good at this. You're really good at this, man, but you're better than me even, but you missed a spot right there. And this will generally end up being just more advice on how to be a lazy leader rather than a diligent handyman, so the information will be ignored by this other person, but usually quietly. The upshot of this is that the conflict relations have the most difficulty overall communicating, because the primary point of interaction is between two functions, the leading and the vulnerable, that can't stand communicating, and the secondary interaction, although comparatively more civil, this is between the creative and the role function. It's both unreliable and ultimately ineffectual. In a word, these are relations of mutual, often painful, and definitely ineffectual correction and critique of each other. Now, as may already be guessed, making a conflict relation work requires both parties to compromise on precisely those things they hate to compromise on, namely things to do with their leading and creative functions. Of course, from a distance, when the parties do not have to coordinate on projects, one generally doesn't experience any kind of problems. It's just fine. Except perhaps when you hear about how the conflictor dealt with a particular situation or some of their particularly type-influenced views. But up close, the psychology is just simply not compatible. Other things may be quite compatible, like the actual interests that they've decided to have, but the personalities have 0 stars. So all I mean by this is that there's no inherent advantages to conflict relations. Whatever could be said about the two people and other aspects of their personalities that could be measured, those things that pertain to MBTI, those things you don't have 0 stars. You might have 5 stars in other areas, but you get 0 stars in this particular area, and it's something you'll have to work over. So any advantages that you get, at least as I understand it here, would have to be the result of hard work and existential bravery of true compromise. The INFJ, in order to get along with the ESTJ, has to come to appreciate the methods of TE empiricism. The INTJ must come to appreciate FE emotivism and group mind and things associated with that. And conversely, the INFJ also has to learn to not be quite so full of themselves with their NI towards the ESTJ and critiquing them on that. You've got to loosen up with that a bit, and so on. So that is essentially conflict relations. In the future, I do plan to make a video that is all about examples of conflict relations, where I would be going actually through like the INTJ, here's their role function, here's their vulnerable function, here's the creative function. So this is sort of another lens for interpreting the function stack and the personality, which I think is very interesting and I think fruitful. And then how would they, for instance, what would sort of be the primary philosophical conflicts when they interact with an ESFJ, and then kind of show the similarities that kind of carry over with the ENTJ versus the ISFJ. I've already begun working on a script for that, but I was originally going to actually have it part of this video, but then realized I really want to take my time with that one. So, and the other thing that I want to work on is the ESFJ Revisited, which I haven't done a whole lot on, unfortunately. I have an older script that I had started before. Anyway, thank you for your patience, thank you so much for your support, and I will see you in the next video.